The Broken Blade, Chapter 16, Prettying Up. To Pierre's surprise, the fight lifted the gloom of the brigade, and once they got back under way, they covered 200 miles in only 3 days. Taking advantage of favorable winds, they hoisted their oilcloth tarps and sailed with little help from the paddles. Bless la ville and the old lady of the wind, Charbonneau declared. Their final afternoon on Superior, they camped only 10 miles from Grand Portage. Pierre asked Charbonneau, "Why don't we just paddle down to the fort tonight?" Though the steersman had been friendly lately, he dismissed the question without a reply, turning instead to prepare his bed. Even Emile refused to explain, only saying quietly, "Just wait and see." The next morning the men rested until well after dawn. When they finally threw off their blankets, they immediately began sprucing themselves up for their arrival at the fort. Pierre was amazed to see men who had been dirty the entire trip suddenly begin to preen themselves with great care. Some bathed, some washed and combed their hair. The most conscientious in the group even unsheathed their hunting knives and trimmed their beards. The men pulled bright sashes and capots out of their packs and donned them with the deliberation of priests dressing in vestments. Beloit hadn't ventured to rinse out so much as a handkerchief on any of their Sunday rest stops, yet he declared this morning his wash day. Before the sun was even full in the sky, the crude fellow stripped off his clothes and waded into the lake. He thrashed his shirts and pants and handkerchiefs around in the icy water, gave them a hasty wringing out, and spread them on the rocks to dry. Except for the dirty cap which remained perched on his head, Beloit ate breakfast naked. No one seemed to notice or care. Only Mr. McKay bothered to joke, "Trying out a new summer uniform, Jean?" Once breakfast was over, the men still showed no sign of leaving, so Pierre decided to go for a swim. He walked over to a rock ledge that had a deep drop-off. Peeling off his clothes, Pierre took a short run and leaped feet first into Superior. The cold stopped his breath, but Emile and Larac, who were standing nearby, cheered his performance. Pierre climbed out, chilled to the bone, but refreshed. They left at mid-morning, and it felt good to be back in the canoe and paddling at a stroke a second pace. Beloit took up a chansom, and the others, out of pity for his croaky voice, joined in. When they rounded Hat Point, Pierre finally saw the fort. He couldn't believe how simply the rude stockade was. Grand Portage was better known in the banking houses and royal courts of Europe than any other place in the Northwest Territory. His father spoke so reverently of the fort that Pierre had imagined a castle. Yet here it was, a lot of pointed logs stuck in the ground with wigwams and tents scattered around it. Grand Portage was the home of 1,000 Ojibwe Indians who built canoes and supplied meat for the company. He also knew it was the rendezvous point for every trader headed west, yet the place looked deserted. There were only a handful of men between the stockade and the beach. Just then La Petite called to Charbonneau, "How about a race to see who unloads?" Pierre groaned. He was sick of the teasing and sick of having to do everyone's work when they lost. He hadn't counted the races they'd lost to campsites and carrying places, but he thought there must have been hundreds. Pierre knew his crew's losses were his fault, and he was convinced a stronger paddler would have surely made a difference. "Fall to!" La Petite yelled. Shouts went up from the canoes, and the men on shore began calling out encouragement. 3 canoes pulled ahead, but Charbonneau's craft held the 4th position until they were only 100 yards offshore. Then, just when Pierre decided they had a chance, the trailing canoe surged past. Knowing they'd lost, Charbonneau's crew shipped their paddles and coasted to shore. As they unloaded the freight, Beloit, who was unused to losing canoe races, complained to Charbonneau, "I don't like the idea of having to carry all these packs just because you got a bunch of milksops on your crew." Beloit leered at Pierre to lend emphasis to his words. "Stop whining, Beloit," Charbonneau countered. "You have a paddle in your hand, too." But Beloit wouldn't quit. "It takes more than one real man to handle a Montreal," he insisted. As he walked over to pick up his first parcel, he jabbed his elbow into Pierre's ribs and bumped him out of the way. Pierre nearly fell, but no one said a word. Feeling totally alone, Pierre picked up a pack and started up the path to the storehouse. Even Emile avoided his eyes. Most of the men trotted as fast as they could up the hill, anxious to get the job done, but Pierre dragged behind. He was convinced his paddling had lost them the race. He thought everyone must be sick of him by now. To make matters worse, each time Beloit met Pierre going up or down the path, the dark man insulted him. "If that pack's too heavy for you, madame," he said one time, "I can get you a hat box to carry." Another time, Beloit said, "Perhaps we can find you a cane if the hill's too steep." Pierre studied the stockade. He couldn't believe he'd traveled 1,200 miles to find a row of log pickets stuck in the mud. For the first time since Lalonde's death, Pierre felt like crying. He returned to the shore and picked up another parcel. Beloit, who had a full load on his back, noticed that his eyes were red. "What's the matter?" he chortled. "Crying for your mama?" Ignoring the man, Pierre turned to hurry back up the trail, but Beloit stuck out his foot. Pierre sprawled across the path, and his pack ripped open. The stack of nested kettles fell clanging onto the rocks. Beloit opened his mouth wide and gulped. "You drop your pot, mother. How will you ever cook supper?" Seized by a sudden rage, Pierre stood and swung his fist at Beloit. "My name is Pierre," he yelled, punching Beloit square in the stomach. The blow knocked the wind out of the bowman. He stumbled and lost his footing on the slippery rocks. Then, with his arms wheeling wildly, he pitched backward into the lake. "Ah!" Beloit bellowed. A column of water flew up, and the men began to laugh. Beloit's feet were still on the shore, but the weight of his packs pulled his chest half under water. He splashed his arms. "Help me, you idiots! Help!" "Lie still and we'll try," Charbonneau offered, stepping forward. "You might consider a please, too," Emile added. Beloit bellowed, "Idiots!" but calmed himself when he almost tipped over onto his face. When Charbonneau and Emile finally pulled him out of the water, he shed his soggy pack and walked straight for Pierre. Pierre felt like bolting for the fort, but he held his ground. With a weird grin, Beloit flexed his fingers. Pierre imagined a huge knobby fist flashing toward him. Beloit grabbed Pierre's right hand and pried it open. "Just checking to see if you have a musket ball hidden there. You packed quite a wallop in that fist, Pierre." Then there was more laughter, and the hauling was suddenly easier to bear. Pierre grabbed the nearest parcel, great to have escaped with his life, and proud that even though it had taken 6 weeks of hard paddling, Beloit had finally called him by his rightful name.